Kurt Cobain's audition lasted exactly 6 minutes before the record executive stopped him and said, "Not commercial." But what happened in the parking lot afterward would spark a cultural revolution that changed music forever. It was February 12, 1988, and 21-year-old Kurt Cobain was sitting in his battered 1963 Dodge Dart in the parking lot of a major record label's Seattle office. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the steering wheel. He'd been sitting there for nearly an hour, trying to build up the courage to walk through that door. Kurt had been dreaming about this moment since he first picked up a guitar at age 14. This was his shot, his chance to prove that the weird, angry music he'd been making in his basement wasn't just noise, that it meant something, that he meant something. But Kurt was terrified. He'd never done a real professional audition before. Sure, he'd played dive bars in Aberdeen and Olympia, basement shows where people were too drunk or too stoned to care what he sounded like. But this was different. This was the music industry. These were the people who decided what America listened to. And Kurt was just a high school dropout from a logging town who worked part-time as a janitor and slept on friends' couches because he couldn't afford rent. Finally, at 2:47 p.m., Kurt forced himself out of the car. He was wearing his only clean shirt, a thrift store flannel that smelled faintly of cigarettes. His jeans had holes in both knees, not from fashion, but from poverty. His blonde hair hung greasy across his face. He grabbed his guitar, a cheap Japanese Fender copy that was missing the low E string, and walked toward the building before he could change his mind. Inside the sleek glass building, everything felt wrong. The receptionist looked at him like he'd tracked mud across her white carpet. The walls were covered with gold records from artists Kurt had never heard of. Smooth, polished pop acts that sounded like they'd been created in a laboratory rather than a garage. Kurt immediately felt out of place. These people wore suits. They spoke in a language of market demographics and radio-friendly hooks. And here he was, unwashed and nervous, about to play music that sounded like a car crash set to a drum beat. "Can I help you?" the receptionist asked, her voice suggesting she hoped the answer was no. "Yeah, I have an audition," Kurt mumbled. "With Mr. Stevens, at 3 o'clock. The receptionist checked her computer with obvious skepticism. "Name? Kurt Cobain. I'm with Nirvana. It's a band. We're a band." She made him wait 20 minutes past his appointment on a leather couch that probably cost more than everything Kurt owned. He watched industry professionals walk past in expensive suits, talking about MTV rotations, and felt himself shrinking. Finally, a young assistant came to get him. "Mr. Stevens will see you now." But Kurt had no idea that what happened in the next 6 minutes would change everything. Mr. Stevens's office was intimidating in its casual elegance. Gold records lined the walls. Through the window, you could see Elliott Bay sparkling in the afternoon sun. Stevens himself sat behind a massive desk, mid-40s, wearing a polo shirt and khakis, looking like someone who played golf on weekends and thought he understood youth culture because he watched MTV. "So," Stevens said, barely looking up from the paperwork on his desk. "Nirvana, tell me about your sound." Kurt cleared his throat. We're kind of a punk band, but with melody. We take influences from the Pixies and Black Sabbath and—" Yeah, Stevens interrupted. "Just play something." Kurt pulled out his guitar, his hands still shaking. He'd prepared for this moment, practiced for hours trying to figure out which song would best represent what Nirvana was about. He'd finally settled on an early version of Negative Creep, raw and aggressive, exactly the kind of music that made him feel alive. He started playing, and for the first few seconds, it felt right. The anger and alienation he'd been carrying since childhood poured out through his fingers. The lyrics, dark and weird and honest, felt true in a way that most music on the radio didn't. But as Kurt played, he could see Stevens's face. The record executive wasn't moved or excited. He looked bored. Worse, he looked annoyed, like Kurt was wasting his time. Then, at exactly 6 minutes into Kurt's performance, Stevens held up his hand. "That's enough." Kurt stopped mid-verse, his heart plummeting into his stomach. Those 2 words. The words every artist dreads. That's enough. Stevens leaned back in his chair and studied Kurt for a long moment. "Kid, let me be straight with you. What you just played, it's not commercial." Kurt felt his face burning. "What do you mean?" "I mean nobody's going to buy this," Stevens said bluntly. "It's too dark, too noisy, too angry. Where's the hook? Where's the melody people can sing along to in their cars? But there is melody, Kurt protested weakly. The verse has, "Let me explain something," Stevens interrupted, walking to his wall of gold records. These artists understand what audiences want. Catchy choruses, clean production, not whatever that was. He turned back. And your image is all wrong. You look unwashed. Your guitar's missing a string. That angry slacker thing won't work on MTV or radio. But look at your influences, Stevens continued. Punk rock? Black Sabbath? That's ancient history. Right now, people want synthesizers, big production, hair metal, or hip-hop. What you're doing is stuck in no man's land. Too weird for rock radio, too rock for alternative. Kurt stood there holding his guitar, feeling every word like a knife. Stevens sat back down. My advice? Go back to Aberdeen, find a regular job. Join a cover band if you want to keep playing music. But this original stuff? It's not going anywhere. You're trying to make music for an audience that doesn't exist. There are people who like what we do, Kurt said quietly. Sure, 50 people who shop at thrift stores and smell like patchouli, Stevens said dismissively. But that's not a market. That's not a career. You need to be realistic about your limitations. What Stevens said next would haunt Kurt for years. And honestly, son, even if your music was commercial, you don't have the charisma to be a frontman. You barely made eye contact during that entire song. You mumbled through the lyrics. Stars have presence. Stars have confidence. You look like you'd rather be anywhere else than on a stage. Stevens stood up, making it clear the meeting was over. I appreciate you coming in, but we're going to pass. Good luck with whatever you end up doing. Kurt walked out of that office, through the lobby with its gold records and leather furniture, and out into the cold Seattle afternoon. He made it about 30 feet into the parking lot before the tears started. He sat in his rusted Dodge Dart, crying so hard he could barely breathe. Everything Stevens had said echoed in his head. Not commercial, too dark, no audience, not a star. Go get a real job. But what happened next in that parking lot would change music history forever. Kurt cried for nearly an hour, watching other musicians come and go. People who looked the part, who had parents supporting their dreams. He thought about Aberdeen. His parents' divorce at 9. Years of bullying for being weird. The chronic pain. Never fitting in anywhere. Music had been his escape from all that. When he played guitar, when he wrote songs, he finally felt like himself. He could channel all that pain and anger and alienation into something that felt real and honest. And now some executive in a polo shirt had told him it wasn't good enough. That he wasn't good enough. Kurt opened the glove compartment and pulled out a battered notebook, the same one he'd been carrying since high school, filled with lyrics and drawings and fragments of thoughts. He flipped to a blank page and wrote down everything Stevens had said. Not commercial, too dark, no hook, not a star, get a real job. Then, underneath those words, something shifted inside Kurt. The pain started transforming into anger, defiance, determination. Kurt began to write his response. You're right. I don't sound like anyone on the radio. That's the point. He paused, then kept writing, the words pouring faster. You're selling safe, polished, fake music. You've confused commercial with safe and art with product. I don't want to be commercial. I want to be real. His hand shook as he continued. You say there's no audience? Maybe thousands of kids are just as angry as me. Sick of being told what to like. Wanting something that reflects how they feel. He underlined the final sentence twice. You say I'm not a star? Good. I'd rather be a failure as myself than a success as someone else. The more Kurt wrote, the clearer things became. Stevens hadn't rejected his music. Stevens had rejected the entire idea that music could be something other than a product. That art could challenge instead of comfort. Kurt made a decision right there in that parking lot. He would keep making exactly the music he wanted to make. He would refuse to sand off the rough edges. If the industry didn't have a box for what he was doing, he'd force them to create a new box. Then Kurt did something that would define the rest of his career. That same night, with the notebook still open on his passenger seat, he drove to Reciprocal Recording, the small Seattle studio where Nirvana had been working with producer Jack Endino. Jack was the opposite of Mr. Stevens, a guy who understood that rawness and imperfection could be powerful. How'd the audition go? Jack asked when Kurt walked in. Terrible, Kurt said. They told me we were not commercial, too dark, no audience. Jack nodded. Yeah, that sounds about right for those guys. So let's prove them wrong, Kurt said. I want to record everything exactly how we play it live. No compromises. If we're going to fail, let's fail being ourselves. Over the next few weeks, Nirvana recorded Bleach for $606.17. Less than Stevens probably spent on lunch. Raw, aggressive, unpolished. Everything Stevens called unmarketable. Kurt kept that notebook page, carrying it to shows. Whenever doubt crept in, whenever someone said, be more mainstream, he'd read those parking lot words. I'd rather be a failure as myself than a success as someone else. And here's where the story gets incredible. Bleach came out in June 1989 on Sub Pop Records, a tiny Seattle label that specialized in exactly the kind of uncommercial music Kurt was making. Nobody expected it to sell. It sold 40,000 copies in its first year, an astonishing number for an independent release with no radio play, no MTV, no major label backing. Just word of mouth from kids who'd been waiting for music that sounded like how they felt. Kurt started noticing something at shows. The audiences weren't the 50 patchouli-smelling hipsters Stevens had dismissed. They were regular kids, teenagers from suburbs and small towns who felt as alienated as Kurt did. Kids who'd been told they should like hair metal or pop music but secretly hated it. Kids who finally heard something that spoke to their actual experience. The thing Stevens had said didn't exist. An audience for raw, angry, honest music was everywhere. By 1990, major labels were suddenly very interested in Nirvana. The same executives who dismissed grunge as not commercial were scrambling to sign Seattle bands. Kurt had multiple offers, including one from Stevens' label. We think you've really developed your sound, Stevens said on the phone. His voice had the same confident tone, apparently not remembering the kid he'd dismissed 2 years earlier. We'd love to discuss a deal. Kurt couldn't help but smile. Let me ask you something. Is my music more commercial now than it was 2 years ago? Well, the market has evolved. No, Kurt interrupted. The music is exactly the same. Raw, dark, no hooks. Everything you said would never work. The only thing that's changed is now other people are making money from it, and you want in. There was a pause. So, are you interested in discussing? I'm signing with DGC Records, Kurt said, but I appreciate you calling. Kurt signed with DGC, a subsidiary of Geffen, because they promised not to interfere with his creative vision. The deal included full artistic control. No executive could tell them to be more commercial. Then came Nevermind. Recorded for $65,000, still modest by industry standards, Nevermind was released in September 1991 with minimal expectations. DGC pressed 50,000 copies, hoping to sell maybe half. By January 1992, Nevermind had knocked Michael Jackson's Dangerous out of the #1 spot on the Billboard 200. It eventually sold 30 million copies worldwide. Smells Like Teen Spirit became one of the most iconic songs in rock history, a song that Stevens would have definitely called not commercial, with its quiet, loud dynamics and mumbled lyrics. The album sparked what music journalists called the grunge revolution. Suddenly, every label wanted to sign bands that sounded like Nirvana. The polished music that had dominated the 80s was out. Raw, authentic, angry music was in. Kurt had proven Stevens wrong about everything. There was an audience for dark, noisy, uncommercial music, an audience of millions who'd been waiting for someone to articulate their frustration. But the most powerful moment came 2 years after Nevermind. In 1993, at the height of Nirvana's fame, Kurt was doing an interview when the journalist asked him about dealing with rejection early in his career. Kurt pulled out that same notebook he'd been carrying since the parking lot in 1988. He opened it to the page with Stevens's words and his response. "This page," Kurt said, "this is the most valuable thing I own. More valuable than any platinum record or Grammy. Because this reminds me that every time someone in power tells you that what you're doing isn't good enough, that you need to change, that's usually a sign you're doing something right. The worst thing I could have done was listen to that guy. If I'd tried to make Nirvana more radio-friendly, we would have just been another forgettable band." The interviewer asked, Do you ever think about contacting that executive? Rubbing his face in it? Kurt shook his head. No, because he did me a favor. He showed me exactly what I didn't want to become. He represented everything wrong with the music industry. The idea that art should be shaped by market research instead of honest expression. And honestly, Kurt continued, guys like him are the reason we needed a revolution. They'd convinced themselves that audiences wanted safe, polished, focus-grouped music. They'd forgotten that what people really want is to feel something real. The story of Kurt and Mr. Stevens became legendary in music circles. Young musicians started seeking out rejection stories, treating them as validation rather than defeat. If the industry told you that you were not commercial, maybe that meant you were doing something genuinely new. The lesson wasn't just about Kurt's success. It was about the danger of letting gatekeepers define what's possible. Stevens wasn't evil. He was just trapped in thinking that confused what has sold before with what could sell now. He couldn't imagine an audience that didn't exist yet. Years later, after Kurt's death in 1994, Stevens admitted, "I thought I was protecting the company, but I was protecting conventional thinking from evolution." Kurt didn't need to change, the industry did. Today, Kurt's rejection is taught in music business classes as a cautionary tale. It reminds executives that commercial isn't fixed. It evolves with artists and audiences. Safe music doesn't inspire passion. It reminds artists that rejection might mean you're onto something new. The goal isn't fitting into categories, it's creating them. Most importantly, it reminds all of us that sometimes the most powerful response to being told you're not good enough is to refuse to change. To believe in your vision so completely that you force the world to meet you where you are. Kurt Cobain's audition lasted 6 minutes before they told him he wasn't commercial enough. 3 years later, he redefined what commercial meant, sparked a cultural revolution, and proved that the most unmarketable music can become the most important. The words Kurt wrote in that parking lot, "I'd rather be a failure as myself than a success as someone else," became a mantra for an entire generation of artists who refused to compromise their vision for someone else's idea of what sells. Kurt kept that notebook until the day he died. On the last page, he'd added one final line after Nevermind hit #1. Turns out there were millions of us. The revolution doesn't start when the industry says yes. It starts in a parking lot when you decide they're wrong.